We've got the Tennessee Titans heading to Pittsburgh to take on the Steelers as 3-point underdogs with a 36.5 point over under. This is Showdown coverage brought to you by sharpfootballanalysis.com. I'm your host, Adam Wilde. And before we jump over to DraftKings, we want to remind you to use promo code SAVE15 to get access to all of our content over at sharpfootballanalysis.com. That is SAVE15 to get 15% off subscriptions at sharpfootballanalysis.com. Let's jump into the slate. This slate is probably the one that I'm the most excited for. And I know that sounds crazy. It's just the Titans and the Steelers. It's a 36.5 point over under. The only thing we really have to worry about is DeAndre Hopkins, who we'll get into in a moment. But the great thing about this slate is it plays out well for small field stuff, cash game stuff, but it's also great for tournaments. I mean, you can pretty much play whoever you want, and you've got viable lineups. The median projection is going to be pretty similar, no matter if you want to stack the Titans or if you want to stack the Steelers. I guess DeAndre Hopkins being out would definitely hinder stacking the Titans, and there's a little bit of ifs with Will Levis's great performance last week that we'll get into as well. But you could pretty much approach this from any angle and come away with some really cool, unique lineups. So that's what we'll get into in just a moment. We've got the easy one right there at the top, Derrick Henry. He's going to handle 75% of the snaps, which is a little lower than what we've been used to seeing with Derrick Henry. But I mean, Tyjae Spears has done well with his opportunities, and obviously Derrick Henry's up there in age, so it makes a little more sense that we're not seeing that like 100% snap share for Derrick Henry or anything like that. But he's still going to get 20 plus touches, and he's going to be the most viable option for those Pittsburgh stacks. And I personally will be stacking Pittsburgh pretty heavily, and I'll give my reasoning why here pretty soon. But Derrick Henry is the one who fits that the most, because you can afford to play Derrick Henry when you have these mid-tier, mid-priced options for the Steelers, and it directly contradicts the Titans passing game. So it works in multiple facets. Now we have DeAndre Hopkins, who practiced in limited fashion Monday and Tuesday, but that doesn't really count because they don't really practice during those times. So it's difficult to say when you have a guy who, played Monday, Tuesday, and then gets downgraded to not non-participant, right? So with that being said, I'm going to say that I think that DeAndre Hopkins will probably be out, but we will discuss both avenues for this slate, and we'll talk about what that's kind of going to do for your lineup. So let's proceed with DeAndre Hopkins out, and then we'll readdress later. Will Levis, 4 touchdowns last week. I don't know, a bunch of crazy stats about how that was like the most touchdowns for a quarterback in his first performance or something like that. I mean, it was pretty phenomenal. However, there were definitely some missed opportunities for him as well, which is going to happen. Of course, it was his first showing. But what that really says to me is that I wouldn't expect that performance again. I would expect him to do okay. I mean, we did like Will Levis going into the year. I was surprised to see him fall out of the first round. I didn't necessarily believe he was going to be a top 10 pick, but I did think that he was going to be inside the first round. So it's not like we didn't expect him to be good, right? But I'm not rushing to pay the 9,600 for him when Kenny Pickett's 9,200 as a home favorite, right? We can fit them both in the lineups and feel okay about it, especially if DeAndre Hopkins is out. But otherwise, I'm going to try to get to these Steelers receivers with that money and omit Will Levis and hope he has a more average performance in this next outing. Brings us down to Kenny Pickett at 9,200. He will be active, doesn't even have an injury designation. He said the whole time that he was going to play, so no surprise there. And that's kind of good because with Mitch Trubisky, we would have had to pretty much just omit George Pickens from our player pool, and now we've got access to Pickens and Deontay Johnson. And those, spoiler alert, are 2 players that I'm going to try to put in as many lineups as possible. So we'll cover George Pickens and Deontay Johnson kind of at the same time. Deontay Johnson came back 2 weeks ago, had like a 66% snap share, and then that jumped all the way up to 90-some percent this past week. So he's all the way back, right? No limitations, and he's going to be more of our PPR kind of guy. But George Pickens, um, you don't even really need to call him boom bust because he seems like he's getting. He's pretty productive on a per game basis too. It's just that he doesn't get a ton of receptions, but it doesn't really matter because he's been so dominant downfield. I mean, you can see, I know it's a terrible indicator, but I guess 8 weeks into the season, it at least tells you that the players involved to see they're like 15.5 fantasy points per game. And you see a guy like George Pickens, who you think about, that's kind of interesting. I mean, he's probably a top 24 wide receiver still. I know he was earlier in the year, and he's a guy that you don't trust very often. So, needless to say, he's going to get into a lot of our lineups when we're stacking Kenny Pickett, probably almost all of them, because of the way that pricing works out with Pickett, Pickens, and Deontay Johnson. Now is where it gets interesting, though, because you have some backs that are involved in Najee Harris and Jalen Warren. Neither of them are we excited about, but they make for some pretty awesome tournament plays because if either one of them falls into the end zone on a slate where the total's only 36.5, they're they're probably finding themselves in the optimal lineup. And that's awesome because their roster percentage is going to be pretty low. I mean, I'm not going to be the only one that's excited to play George Pickens and Deontay Johnson. So Najee Harris and Jalen Warren. I would say Najee Harris probably still maybe one more week has the nod with in terms of roster percentage. We saw the exact same thing happen with Ezekiel Elliott and Tony Pollard. DraftKings was weary to get Tony Pollard's price over Ezekiel Elliott's. We were weary to play Tony Pollard over Ezekiel Elliott. And just as the season dragged on, finally, towards the end of the year, you finally saw Tony Pollard. At one point, they were tied for a couple slates. And then I do believe that Tony Pollard ended up being more expensive. And it looks like Jalen Warren's on that same trajectory. It's a little less exciting, though, because this offense is less productive rushing the football. But Jalen Warren at 6,400 makes for an excellent tournament play because, for one, if the Steelers find themselves down, which it's only a 3-point spread and a really low total, so Steelers could definitely find themselves down in this game. Jalen Warren's going to have some PPR upside, and then Najee Harris is just the more expensive one, but he is the quote unquote starter, right? So he's probably going to get a little bit more run. So he's not as sneaky, but he's also a fine tournament option. I would not play them both, and that's a lot coming from me because I'm a huge advocate for playing two running backs from the same team in Showdown because it's one of those rules we always talk about. Like sometimes I'm looking for reasons to not omit certain things from lineups just because people are so adamant about clicking the rule sets when they're building their lineups, the same rule sets week in and week out, right? And one of them that you're going to click often is do not allow two running backs from the same team. So on slates where that's viable, I'm super pumped to include that. But these two backs, they're too expensive. Usually you'll have an expensive one, and like totally fine playing Derrick Henry and Tyjae Spears in a lineup or two in tournaments, right? But these two backs for the Steelers are too expensive, and they're just direct contradictions to each other, and neither of them really get enough work to I don't know, to warrant two of them. Like there's not enough to go around for both of them to be viable together. So maybe I'll eat my words and maybe they'll both be in the optimal lineup. But I think that's one I'm going to skip out on here at 5,400. Tyjae Spears has been doing really well with his opportunities. I'm pleasantly surprised as somebody who partakes in a lot of dynasty, but 5,400, he's gotten pretty expensive. Once you get above the kickers, you really need to have like a certain volume threshold for me to where once you get past the kickers range. Like if Tyjae Spears is 3,800, where he probably should be, or even down there with Chig. I mean, for example, I'd rather Treylon Burks at 3,800, right? So that makes it really hard to consider Tyjae Spears. So even though he's been productive in shim flashes and looked talented, 5,400 gets him a little bit high, not because of, or it is a little high, not because of his ability, but because you see both kickers in that range. You see Chig in that range. You have Burks even cheaper than that. So you still have viable options underneath them. So Tyjae Spears is somebody that I will reserve for like maybe mid to large tournaments, but not somebody I'm going to completely omit because for that same reason that I just said, people will be uncomfortable playing him, a little harder to click his name. ipso facto, now we've got a good tournament play, right? That's how Showdown works. It's a fickle beast, as I like to say. So don't completely omit Tyjae Spears, but in small field stuff or cash stuff, there's like a few better options than Spears on a point per dollar basis. That takes you down to Chig has been a little bit Chig Okonkwo has been a little bit disappointing. I know that going into the season, I thought he was going to be probably a top 12 tight end. I really thought his role was going to expand. He's had some very, very electric plays in his time in the NFL, and it just has not panned out for him yet. And here at 4,200, for similar reasons as Tyjae Spears not being super viable, Chig's not going to be super viable on this slate either. Maybe he gets a slight boost if we see DeAndre Hopkins out, but probably not going to be directly correlated with Chig anyways. That's going to be like Treylon Burks getting a boost to the moon and not really much different for Chig. So somebody I guess you can consider if you are going to be someone who subscribes to those Tennessee Titans builds, but as somebody who's going to be stacking Pittsburgh, I don't see getting to Chig. I guess he will fit in the kind of build because let's get a little bit of a preview. We're going to be trying to fit Pickens, Deontay Johnson, Kenny Pickett, and Derrick Henry in a lot of our lineups. What that does is that leaves us enough money for like a $4,000 player and a punt play, but it also doesn't leave us a ton of variety, right? So when you're doing a 20 max, you probably do get to Chig on one or two lineups. You probably do get to Tyjae Spears on one or two lineups for the simple fact that you've got such a tight core that you're not used to that you're going to have to cycle through those players. So that's how you find yourself on a Chig or a Tyjae Spears, even though they're not the most optimal. You have such a tight core with those four players that you're going to have to rotate those last two positions quite a bit. Same thing with Treylon Burks. He's a fine play at 3,800, assuming that Will Levis is okay at football, right? Because Ryan Tannehill had a pretty steep drop off, and it's been a struggle for him to basically get anything done in the passing game. So you certainly couldn't trust Treylon Burks, and that's how his price got to 3,800, even though he's a full-time player. Now, if Will Levis can be a productive passer, we're really cooking with Treylon Burks at 3,800. So Treylon Burks is super viable. Maybe not cash game, probably not getting there in cash game because you're going to be able to afford a kicker. But other than that, small field stuff, 3 max small field stuff, plenty happy with Treylon Burks. And then, of course, if DeAndre Hopkins is out, yes, absolutely. Treylon Burks is going to be the starting receiver, and he can succeed in some of the same ways that DeAndre Hopkins succeeded last week, which I believe was all slants. I'm not 100% certain, but I'm almost sure. If not all slants, I think all 3 of DeAndre Hopkins' big plays were on in-breaking routes, and that's something. Those short in-breaking routes are something that Treylon Burks can actually do fairly well. Now, once you get after Treylon Burks, Hopkins won't miss. Yeah, I hope Hopkins doesn't miss. Like I mentioned earlier, the only reason that I am worried is because what's the point in listing him as a did not participate on a Wednesday when he was limited Monday and Tuesday, because they don't actually practice on these short weeks. So there's no incentive for listing him as a do not participate. I do believe that he will probably go because like most people say, he doesn't need the practice, right? But the issue is just then like what are the Titans doing, right? You can't just put somebody on the injury report that's not actually injured. So we'll see how it plays out. We've got the scenarios played out for both. It doesn't really matter. Frankly, I'm not going to get to a lot of DeAndre Hopkins with the way I'm looking at this slate anyways. This brings us down to a kind of ugly range, but another reason that I'm so adamant about stacking Pittsburgh is that you have actually 3 really viable options there in this price range. You have Cam Hayward, Allen Robinson, and Calvin Austin. So Cam Hayward, the most viable of the 3, full-time starter. Pat Freiermuth still on IR. But then you have Allen Robinson playing about 60% of snaps, not doing much with his 60% of the snaps, but now he's at 2,200. And then you have Calvin Austin, who I do think is going to start eating into Allen Robinson's snaps, just because I do think that Calvin Austin brings an element to the offense that Allen Robinson has not been bringing, right? So at some point, that flip is going to happen. Same thing I always talk about with the Giants. At some point, those rookies, Jalen Hyatt is going to is going to start having a bigger role. So basically what happened is Calvin Austin and Allen Robinson were both full-time players while Deontay Johnson was out. In fact, when Deontay Johnson missed the first game, when he went out in the first game, Calvin Austin took all of the rest of the snaps for the rest of the game. It's like I think Deontay played 43%, and then Calvin Austin played 56 or whatever. And then as Deontay Johnson came back, Allen Robinson played most of the snaps in the first game. Calvin Austin got up to 27% last week, and I do think he will experience one more jump. So I would look to those Steelers guys. We're running out of time, so I'm not even going to touch on the like Nick Westbrook-Akine or Kyle Phillips or Chris Moore. I don't think you need to get to any of those three. So let's just try to build one of these Steelers lineups while we still have time, and you can kind of see what I'm thinking about for this slate. So Kenny Pickett in the captain at the top, just because I don't think he'll be as popular as Deontay Johnson or Kenny Pickett, or Pickens. So I'll just throw him in there just to be a little bit of contrarian, and then yeah, you can go here, Pickens, Johnson, and then you have, this is where I was talking about, once you have these four guys, since Pickett, Pickens, and Johnson are similar, you can rotate them at captain and a 20 max or something like that, and then you're just messing with these two spots left, right? So you can do a lot with these two spots. Let's play it safe first and do like Nick Folk and Cam Hayward, and then you have no money left, right? But this is a super safe lineup. Like, this is something that's probably going to be cash viable. Maybe you put one of the receivers in at captain with a little bit higher floor and ceiling, which is weird to say about a quarterback, but with this low total, probably true. But this is something that's super viable. But basically what I was talking about is, I mean, now you want Deontay Johnson in a captain, and you throw in Pickett. Now you have $400 left, and bam, now you have your next lineup. And then you do the same thing. You'll throw George Pickens at captain, and you'll put Deontay Johnson back in the flex, and you can just rotate and rotate on through. You could almost even put Derrick Henry at captain, and then go cheaper than Nick Folk. But that doesn't pan out that often with a running back where you have the underdog in a 4x2 as one of your captains. Is not a great strategy typically. But yeah, so that's where I'm going with this slate. Mostly Steelers. You can rotate through those core guys. Mostly Derrick Henry. If DeAndre Hopkins is active, of course you can go with DeAndre Hopkins. But I will prefer Derrick Henry at that expensive price range, right? So that's going to do it for this week for Showdown coverage, brought to you by sharpfootballanalysis.com. I'm your host, Adam Wilde, and I'll catch y'all next week. Peace.